This lecture is on the cosmological argument. It was actually a name that describes a certain type of argument for God's existence, an a posteriori argument, an argument that appeals in some way to our sense experience to prove that God exists. We're going to focus on two versions of the cosmological argument, or at least a group of versions presented by Aquinas, and then an argument from the modern period by Samuel Clarke. They're both cosmological arguments, or give us kind of an idea of what a cosmological argument is for God's existence. In Aquinas' The Five Ways, which was the reading for this lecture, he actually gives 5 arguments for God's existence, but just the first 3 could be described as cosmological arguments. And they're the argument from motion, the argument from efficient cause, the argument from possibility, and necessity. I'm kind of going to quickly go through these and then kind of show you the common features about these 3 arguments which they share with Clarke's version of the cosmological argument. And then we'll kind of have a cleaned up, formalized version of the argument to look at. Okay, so the first is the argument from motion. Didn't really need this slide, did I? I should say something about cosmology, right? It's the study of the universe. And so a cosmological argument makes us appeal to something about the nature of the universe such that it has to be the case that God exists. So that's what these arguments all have in common. So here the first is the argument from motion. So the argument from motion begins with an observation about the universe, and that's that things are in motion, or that they change, that trees grow and things live and die, that water flows down streams, that seasons come and go. So there's an observation about the way the world is. Here's one translation of the first argument. It is certain and evident to our sense experience, notice that in the world some things are in motion. Now whatever is moved by another, for nothing can be moved except it is in potentiality to that towards which it is moved, whereas a thing moves inasmuch as it is in act. For motion is nothing else than the reduction of something from potentiality to actuality. But nothing can be moved from a state of potentiality to actuality except by something in a state of actuality. It is therefore impossible that in the same respect and in the same way a thing should both be mover and moved. That is, that it should move itself. Therefore, whatever is moved must be moved by another. If that by which it is moved must itself be moved, then this also needs to be moved by another, and that by another again. But this cannot go on to infinity, because then there would be no first mover, and consequently no other mover, seeing as subsequent movers move only inasmuch as they are moved by the first mover. As the staff moves only because it is moved by the hand. Therefore it is necessary to arrive at the first mover, moved by no other, and this everyone understands to be God. The first argument then makes an observation about the universe, that things change, that they're put into motion, and it says that change can't come from within, it must come from outside of the thing that changes. And then it has to be changed. Whatever does the moving is itself moving, so it has to be caused to move by something else. And then there's this idea here in premise 3 that there can't be an infinite series of movers, that the thing that moves A is B, and the thing that moves B is C, and the thing that moves C is D, and then there can't be this infinite series of movers. Little alarm bells should go off. Why not? And therefore it posits the existence of a first mover, an unmoved mover, and it assumes that this is God. In the second argument, the argument from efficient cause, we need to get some terminology straight. Aquinas borrowed a lot of his metaphysics from Aristotle, and this way of talking about causes and different types of causes can be attributed to Aristotle. The argument here is from the efficient cause, and so we need to think about what it means for something to be the cause of something else. And Aristotle identified what he took to be 4 distinct ways in which we talk about the cause of a thing. The material cause of a thing is the stuff that makes that thing. So the material cause of my coffee cup is this, I don't know what it is, metal, plastic. It's the stuff that it's made of. The formal cause of the thing is the idea or the plan, which is a thing from which a thing is caused. So that this plastic or metal, if it weren't planned to be a cup, it wouldn't be a cup. That you have to have both matter and form, the idea that makes the matter into the kind of thing that it is. And then an efficient cause is the causal agent, the thing that actually informed the matter, put the matter into a particular form, and so say the person who manufactured the cup. And then there's the final cause, and that's what makes the cup the kind of thing it is, that it actually holds coffee and keeps it relatively warm. It's like a travel cup that I'm looking at. So the final cause of a thing is that it performs its function well. Now here, in the argument from efficient causes, Aquinas points out that there's an order of efficient causes, that one thing's existence is caused by another thing that's external to itself. And so just again to distinguish these 4 different types of causes, consider the following. The material cause is the stuff of which a thing is made. So a house that's made of bricks, its material cause is the stuff that makes it, which is the bricks. The formal cause is the plan. Here are the plans, the architectural drawings. The efficient cause is the agent that puts it all together. And the final cause is that it's a house, that it performs its function, that it shelters people from the elements. So here's the passage in which Aquinas lays out the second argument. The second way is from the nature of efficient cause, so the causal agents. In the world of sensible things, again, notice this appeal to the world that we know by sense experience. In that world we find there is an order of efficient causes. There is no case known, neither is it indeed possible, in which a thing is found to be the efficient cause of itself. Something can't cause itself, at least not in the sensible world, for so it would be prior to itself, which is impossible. The cause of a thing comes before it, and a thing can't come before itself. Now, in efficient causes, it is not possible to go on to affinity, because in all efficient causes, following in order, the first is the cause of the intermediate cause, whether the intermediate cause be several or only one. Now, take away the cause. To take away the cause is to take away the effect. Therefore, if there be no first cause among efficient causes, there'll be no ultimate or intermediate cause. But if in efficient causes it is possible to go on to infinity, there will be no first efficient cause, neither will there be an ultimate effect, nor any intermediate efficient causes, all of which is plainly false. Therefore, it is necessary to admit a first efficient cause, to which everyone gives the name of God. So the argument from efficient causes starts with this observation about the sensible world, that things are caused by something external to themselves. And what we mean by caused here is that their existence is brought about by something external to themselves. Nothing can be the cause of itself, so it has to be caused by something else. And there can't be an infinite series of efficient causes. Now, there's some reason given for this, and I'm going to gloss over that for now because I'm going to put it in more contemporary terms in a minute. So it can't be that there's an infinite series of efficient causes, therefore God is the first cause. So the first argument is God is the unmoved mover. The second argument is God is the first cause, who is himself uncaused. Now the third argument is called the argument from possibility and necessity. The idea here is that something can't come from nothing. The third way is taken from possibility and necessity, and it runs thusly. We find in nature things that are possible to be and not to be. So remember, by definition of a contingent thing is anything that exists but might not have existed. Since they are found to be and I want to say something else about this first sentence. We find in nature. So based on sense experience, looking around the world, what we see are things that exist, and thus they're possible things, but they are contingent things. They're things that might not have existed. Since they are found to be generated and to be corrupted, and consequently it's possible for them to be and not to be, but it is impossible for these always to exist, for that which can not be at some time is not. So for any given thing that might not have existed, there was a time when it didn't exist. So it had to have come into being. Therefore, if everything can not be, if it could be imagined that everything that exists did at a time not exist, then at one time there was nothing in existence. Now, if this were true, even now there would be nothing in existence, because that which does not exist begins to exist only through something already existing. Do you get it? So for everything that exists might not have existed. That is, there was a time when it didn't exist. But if that's the case for everything, then there was a time when nothing existed. But then all of this stuff would have come from nothing, and something can't come from nothing. Therefore, if at one time nothing was in existence, it would have been impossible for anything to have begun to exist, and thus even now nothing would be in existence, which is absurd. Therefore, not all beings are merely possible, but there must exist something, the existence of which is necessary. But every necessary thing either has its necessity caused by another or not. Now it is impossible to go on to infinity in necessary things which have their necessity caused by another, as has already been proved in regard to efficient causes. Therefore, we cannot but admit the existence of some being having of itself its own necessity and not receiving it from another, but rather causing it in others their necessity. This all men speak of as God. So we had God as the first mover, the unmoved mover. Then in the second argument, God is the first efficient cause, the uncaused being. And now here, the idea is it can't be the case that everything exists as a contingent thing, that something has to be necessary and to have always have existed. Because if it was contingent itself, then there was a time when it didn't exist, there would have been a time when nothing existed, and something can't come from nothing. So there must be something that is necessary, and it cannot be caused by itself. The necessary thing that exists could be caused by another necessary thing, which could itself be caused by another necessary thing. But it has to be the case that there can't be an infinite series, that there's ultimately just one beginning, one first necessary being that is itself the efficient cause of all these other contingent things. Call it God. Now, I think this is the sort of argument that a lot of people appeal to when they try to give reason for thinking it's true that God exists. They say, look, something can't come from nothing. There has to be a cause for all of this, for this universe. There has to be an explanation for the existence of all of this stuff. And that's the theme in a cosmological argument, that there has to have been some beginning or some explanation. Now, Aquinas is more noted for thinking there had to be a first cause, a first mover, a beginning, and it's very temporal. Whereas in the contemporary version, the modern version, Samuel Clarke's version of the cosmological argument, it's going to be less so about some temporal beginning. It's going to be more about the explanation for the existence of things. Stand by for that in just a moment. So this third argument, the argument from possibility and necessity, looks something like this. The first premise, possible or contingent things exist. Now we know that on the basis of sense experience. We look around and we see there are coffee cups, and we can imagine a world before there were coffee cups. But what about trees? Well, okay, there could be a time before there were trees and rocks and people and bunny rabbits. And we know this on the basis of sense experience, that the things that exist are not necessary things, that they are contingent and possible. What makes them possible is that they actually do exist, so they could, and contingent is that they might not have existed. Whatever is contingent is non-existent at some time. That is, it didn't always exist. There had to have been a time when it didn't exist. If everything were contingent, there would be a time when nothing existed, and something cannot come from nothing. So there must be some necessary or eternal thing. Now there cannot be an infinite series of necessary things, and this he appeals to the previous argument, the argument from efficient causes. Thus there must be something that has always existed, a necessary thing that is the cause of itself. Call it God. Alrighty. Now we're getting something that's a little bit closer to Samuel Clarke's version of the cosmological argument. What I want you to get from these first three arguments that Aquinas provides is the elements that make these cosmological arguments. Okay, a cosmological argument is an a posteriori argument for God's existence. So remember, the ontological argument was an a priori argument based on reason prior to sense experience. So the idea was, in the ontological argument, if you can grasp the concept of God as the greatest conceivable being, then you know that it's true that he exists, because if he didn't, he could be imagined to be greater, but then he'd be both the greatest conceivable being and not the greatest conceivable being, and that's a contradiction. And contradictions can't be true, so it's not the case that God exists only in the imagination. God exists for real. There's no appeal to what we see or experience or sense. Now, a posteriori means based on sense experience. Now, all of these arguments appeal to something we know on the basis of sense experience. But that is not that we see or smell or touch or taste God. It's that we see or smell or touch or taste things in the universe. So we look around and we see things like keys and cell phones and computers and bunny rabbits and kitty cats and tigers and buildings, that we look around the world and we see all of these things in the world. And so that's the a posteriori observation that forms the first premise in each of these arguments. And so in the argument from motion, on the basis of sense experience, we come to know that things move or change. We see it happen. We experience it ourselves. In the second argument, the argument from efficient causes, we see that things are caused to exist. The things that exist in the world, like coffee cups or keys or coats, are brought into existence by something external to them. Somebody makes them. And then third, the argument from possibility and necessity, that we notice that a certain type of thing exists in the world. The things that we notice in the world are possible things, because they do exist, and they're contingent. That is, they're things that didn't always exist, that there was a time before they existed. And so it's not that we notice necessary things, we don't notice impossible things, we don't notice or see God or any of those things. But each of these arguments has an a posteriori premise, a premise that says there's something that we know on the basis of sense experience about the world. Each of these arguments has the same strategy, and they employ a reductio ad infinitum. Now this is a variety of reductio ad absurdum. So remember, the ontological argument, the valid form that it took, was a reductio ad absurdum, reduced to absurdity. And there we assumed some proposition P was true. We derived an absurdity, which there was a contradiction, and then we were allowed to deny the initial assumption. Here, a reductio ad infinitum is a type of reductio ad absurdum. Sorry, it's really hard to say. What I'm doing is I'm taking a proposition and I'm reducing it to a particular type of absurdity. Instead of a contradiction, it's an infinite regress. And since things can't go on infinitely, I'll explain that better in a minute, I hope, then there's something wrong with my assumption. It's not going to be an assumption. I'm just going to show that deny there can be an infinite regress. So in each of these three arguments, the first one says there can't be an infinite series of movers. The second one says there cannot be an infinite series of causes. And the third one says there can't be an infinite series of necessary things. I'm going to say more about why that's the case in just a moment, in the modern version of this. Okay, so they all have this a posteriori appeal. They all are reductio ad infinitums. They point out some infinite regress. And then what do we get? We get some explanation for why there are things that exist, why we exist, why the universe itself exists. That there's this appeal that we need to have an explanation for the existence of the universe. And so this is why this is a cosmological argument. Now, things either have an explanation or a cause for their existence or they do not. And if they have a cause for their explanation or an explanation for their existence, that's either external to a thing or internal to it. So we're looking at the universe and we're trying to come up with some explanation for its existence. We're going to say it's either caused by itself or caused by something external to it. And at least Aquinas' version are all pointing to it can't be caused by itself. There has to be some first mover that put in the change, some first efficient cause, some necessary being that's always existed that caused the universe to exist. But this sort of appeal to this need to explain the existence of the universe has not been well explained by Aquinas, at least not in these first three arguments. So what happens in the modern version is that this idea that things have an explanation for their existence or that they're caused to exist is laid out a little bit more formally in a principle called the principle of sufficient reason. So think about how things come to be. And if you like, we can think of their efficient cause, like Aristotle, the builder that builds the house. Or we can think of the explanation, some story that can be told about how the house came to be, that it was made by a builder. So for every given thing that exists, here are the two logical possibilities. That thing either has no explanation, it's not caused to exist, or it does have an explanation. Now here's the technical term. For a logical possibility, we're not yet saying that this is a real possibility, but just that it's a logical possibility that there could exist something that it's uncaused, that there's no story that can be told about how it came to exist. Poof, there it is, right? And that's called a brute fact. Now, on the other hand, what seems more likely, at least right now I want you to think that, is that things that exist are caused to exist, that there's some story that can be told about how they came to exist. That is, that most things have an explanation. So that's on the right side of my first split. Yes, things have an explanation or they're caused to exist. Now here's yet another division of possibility. For everything that's caused to exist or has an explanation for its own existence, it's either caused by itself or it's caused by something else. And so when I say, does X contain within itself explanation for its own existence? Is it self-explanatory? Is it self-caused? If no, yes and no seem like the only two possibilities here, right? Either yes or no. If no, it's not self-caused, it doesn't contain within itself explanation for its own existence, we call that a dependent thing. A thing whose existence depends on something external to itself. On the other hand, we can, try to imagine there's a thing that is not caused by anything external to it, that it contains within itself sufficient reason for its own existence, that it's self-caused or self-explanatory, and those things we'll call self-existent things. Now here's where it'd be helpful if you just go read the Samuel Clarke version. It's on Blackboard. It's one page, because this language I'm borrowing from him. So here are this exhausts the logical possibility of the types of things that exist when we think about those things in terms of their existence, right? How they came to be. There are either brute facts, that is, things that have no explanation or caused, uncaused things. There are dependent things, that is, things whose existence is dependent on something external to themselves, or there are self-existent things that are caused or explained by themselves. They're self-caused. Okay, so this exhausts the logical possibility. Now the question is, what sorts of things actually exist? Is some of each of them, only one type? What actually exists? So here's the principle of sufficient reason. And you have a very short reading from, let me think, who is this? Rowe on the principle of sufficient reason. And what I should do, I'll try to also put up a little bit from Taylor on there, giving a positive account or something like it of the principle of sufficient reason. But according to this principle, there must be an explanation for or a cause of two things, the existence of anything and any positive fact. So let me explain this a little bit. imagine that you're walking on the beach and you come across something you've never seen before. Maybe it has some unfamiliar shape, some unfamiliar texture, some unfamiliar color. You can't imagine for the life of you what it is. Now, do you assume that this thing popped into existence? Or do you assume that it was caused to exist, or there's some explanation for what it is, even if you don't know what it is? The idea here is supposed to be that, look, when we think about things that we encounter in the world, even if they're new and unfamiliar to us, we never assume they just popped into existence. That even if we don't know the cause or existence of a thing, we assume that there is a cause for the existence of a thing, or an explanation or a reason for a thing being where it is and what it is. So the idea here is that for any given thing that exists, it has some explanation for its existence, some cause or its cause to exist. Now, the second element in the principle of sufficient reason is the idea that for any positive fact, it has an explanation. Now, a positive fact would be there's a coffee cup on the table. That's a fact. I'm looking at it. Now, that has some explanation or some account, some story can be told in virtue of which that is true. So I put it on the table, right, that I brought it from home, and I put it on the desk in front of me. So there's some story, some explanation for that positive fact. Compare that with a negative fact. There are no elephants in this room. That negative fact does not require an explanation according to the principle of sufficient reason. I mean, there's like a million stories that could be told about that negative fact. I didn't bring an elephant, my colleagues didn't bring an elephant, there were no elephants were loose on the streets today. I mean, there's like all of these negative facts that those don't require any explanation. But if something is true, that is, if it's a positive fact, then there's some story that can be told in virtue of which its truth is explained. You with me? Okay. So now look at the three different types of things that are logically possible. Things are either brute facts and have no explanation. They're dependent things, that is, their explanation or cause is external to themselves, or they're self-existent things. Now, that was just brainstorming about the logical possibility of the types of things that exist. Now, given the principle of sufficient reason, that rules out the possibility of one of these types of things. Which one? There must be an explanation. There must be an explanation. Which of those has no explanation? Brute facts, right? By definition. So according to the principle of sufficient reason, there are no brute facts. Okay? There we go. I even crossed it out for us. The principle of sufficient reason is, inconsistent with the existence of brute facts. So here we get the first premise of the modern formulation of the cosmological argument, and this is more or less Samuel Clarke. So go read it. It's just one page. Every being that exists is either a dependent being or a self-existent being. Okay, that is, there are no brute facts. And what reason do I have for thinking that's true? Well, I have it in square brackets there. The principle of sufficient reason, part 1. It says, everything has an explanation. Brute facts have no explanation, so there are no brute facts, so everything that exists is either dependent or self-existent. Now, the second premise of the cosmological argument is this. It's not the case that every being is dependent. Now, would you know what conclusion would follow from these two premises? Every being that exists is either dependent or self-existent. Not every being is dependent, so at least one thing is self-existent, right? Now, I need some reason first for thinking the second premise is true. Why can it be the case that every single thing that exists is dependent? So imagine, here are my things that exist, D1, D2, D3, D4. So to say that D1 is a dependent thing is to say it was caused to exist by something external to itself, call it D2. To say D2 is a dependent thing is to say it was caused to exist by something external to itself, D3. And that little 8 on its side means infinity. And the second premise says this is not what the universe looks like. It can't be that we have this series of dependent things that goes on to infinity. This is very Aquinas, right? Remember, he had a reductio ad infinitum in each of the three arguments. He said these can't go on to infinity. Well, why not? What did Aquinas say? Aquinas said, well, because there has to be a first cause. Why is that? Now, Aquinas perhaps didn't have the concept of infinity, that he couldn't imagine that that could actually be the case, that something could go on to infinity. But we could get around Aquinas' objection and just make it cyclical. Let's say D4 is caused by D1, some nice little causal loops happening. But why would that be inconsistent? Well, what's the problem with that? And here's what the proponent of the cosmological argument says. If it were the case that every single thing that exists was dependent, and there were an infinite or cyclical series of dependent things, that would be a positive fact about the universe. An infinite series of dependent beings exists. Okay? If that's a positive fact about the universe, according to the principle of sufficient reason, that needs an explanation. There must be some story that can be told which would make that positive fact true. Just like there's a coffee cup on the table, I can tell the story in virtue of which, that fact is true. I put it there. How about this fact? There's an infinite series of dependent beings that exist. Now, if that's a positive fact about the universe, there has to be some story of it that can be told in virtue of which that fact is true. At least that's what the principle of sufficient reason, the second part of it, says. So, suppose that fact, that there is an infinite series of dependent things, is explained by, call it S1. Okay? S1 is the fact that an infinite series of dependent things exists. And let's suppose S1 is explained by F1, which is itself like a dependent fact, a fact that's explained by something external to itself, F2, and then, so like each time you have an explanation of one of these facts, you then have a bigger fact about the universe. So for example, our fact number 1 is, I'm calling it S1 here. An infinite series of dependent beings exist. That's our fact 1, and that's explained by S1. But now I have a new fact, call it a bigger fact, that there's an infinite series of dependent beings that's explained by S1. Okay, what explains that? Call it F1. Okay, so now I have a bigger fact. An infinite series of dependent beings is explained by S1, which is explained by F1. But now that's a fact, and that needs an explanation. So there's an infinite series of dependent beings that's explained by S1, which is explained by F1, which is explained by F2. Now that needs an explanation. Every time I try to give an account or an explanation of one of these positive facts, I do so in terms of a positive fact which itself needs some explanation. Do you see? And it keeps getting like these bigger and bigger facts. But if that's the case, then there's always some fact that needs to be explained. So the second premise here, not every being is dependent, does not need to appeal, as Aquinas did, to there being a first cause or an unmoved mover. Doesn't need that. The idea is that if everything were dependent, then there would always be some fact about the universe that had no explanation, and that violates the second part of the principle of sufficient reason. That principle says there must be an explanation for the existence of anything. So premise 1 says there are no brute facts. And there must be an explanation for any positive fact. That's premise 2. So not everything can be dependent, because then there'd be some positive fact that didn't have an explanation. And it follows from those two premises, it validly follows, that there must be some self-existent being. That is a valid inference, by the way. Now, something to note about it, the conclusion does not say anything at all about God. It just says there's at least one self-existent being. Maybe there's 100, who knows. It would take another step to argue that that self-existent being is God. We need a whole new argument, but we never get there, because this argument fails. The validity of this argument, it has an argument form of a disjunctive syllogism. A disjunction is an or statement. Now this, we have a little bit of, we have quantifiers in our premises. You don't have to worry about that until you take advanced logic. But here, the premise 1 says either D, everything is of type D or S. It's not the case that everything is D, so something is S. And this is valid. I can give you an analogous argument. Everyone in the room is either a teacher or a student. It's not the case that everyone is a teacher, so somebody is a student. So that's a valid inference to make. If the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. And so remember, to determine whether an argument is sound or not, we ask, is it valid? And this argument is valid. And the second thing we ask is, are the premises true? So here is the valid argument form, disjunctive syllogism. I didn't print out all these slides, that's why I don't really know what's coming next. Disjunctive syllogism is valid, so this argument, in order to be sound, would not only have to be valid, but also have true premises. Now, look at the premises. What reason is provided for the truth of those premises? Premise 1 appeals to the first part of the principle of sufficient reason, and premise 2 appeals to the second part of the principle of sufficient reason. That is, the truth of those premises rests on the truth of the principle of sufficient reason. Is the principle of sufficient reason true? What reason do we have for thinking it's true? The burden of proof here falls to the proponent of the cosmological argument, that is, the person who's defending the argument, to prove that the principle of sufficient reason is true. Now here, I will Xerox, I hope I've done this already, an excerpt from Richard Taylor, that doesn't sound right, William Taylor? Taylor, from Taylor's article where he tries to defend the principle of sufficient reason. And these are the kinds of things he says. He says, it's intuitively true. We just know it to be true. Right? We don't have any proof, he says. There's no reason for thinking it's true. He says it's a presupposition of reason. It comes before our ability to reason. But it itself is not the product of reason. He says it's a datum. It's a given. That is, it has no explanation. Why should we think the principle of sufficient reason is true? Oh, it just is, he says. Are you convinced? Think about what it means to say that something is intuitively true. What does that mean? It seems true. It's obviously true. We can't conceive of it being false. I mean, the principle of sufficient reason rules out the possibility of brute facts. Is it really impossible to imagine that there could be a brute fact? That something just popped into existence? That something came from nothing? And some people might say that the Big Bang is exactly that sort of thing. There was nothing and then boom. Who knows? Maybe quantum physics gives us reason for thinking that there are quantum particles that don't exist and then all of a sudden come into existence. It's not impossible to imagine that it's false, and so it's not obviously true. I can conceive of it being false. Maybe it mostly seems true, it seems plausible, but it's not without exception. It's not impossible. Like, I cannot conceive of a round square, but I can consider the possibility that the principle of sufficient reason is false. So I wouldn't want to say that it's intuitively true. Now, when he says it's a presupposition of reason, he's saying presupposition. Pre means before, supposition means to suppose. That we suppose it's true prior to being able to reason. But is it? The idea here is that we could not reason unless PSR were true, but then PSR is not true unless we can reason. That is, unless we can ask for explanations. We can give arguments in defense of claims. But this doesn't seem like a very good defense of the principle because it seems to beg the question. That's a type of fallacy. That is, it assumes the principle of sufficient reason is true in order to show that it's true. Why should we think it's true? Well, we just assume it's true to show that it's true. But wait, that doesn't tell me that it actually is true. You're just assuming it's true to show that it's true. But we don't know yet that it's true. That's to argue in a circle or to commit the fallacy called begging the question or circular reasoning. So the second defense of the principle of sufficient reason is not very strong. Third, he says it's a datum, a given. He says there is no reason for it being true. It's just basic. It just is. There is no explanation for the principle of sufficient reason, which says everything has an explanation. This defense of the principle says that it's a brute fact, but the principle says there are no brute facts. I mean, is it likely to be true that everything that exists is caused to exist? Everything has an explanation for its existence. Perhaps. Maybe that's the case. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the explanation has to be God. It could be that the universe contains within itself its own explanation for existing. It's something like the universe is a self-existent being. If we reject PSR outright, we could say that the universe is brute fact. There are brute facts, so maybe the universe is that. Or if we accept PSR, we could say that maybe the universe is just a self-existent being. That's thing. That's consistent with PSR. So either with or without PSR, we still do not need God. And we have no terribly good reason for accepting the principle of sufficient reason. And so the proponent of this argument has not offered a convincing case. Oh, I didn't know I had this slide. So if we reject PSR, brute facts are possible, and maybe the universe is a brute fact. If we accept PSR, maybe the universe itself is a self-existent thing. Either way, since the truth of the premises in the cosmological argument rests on the truth of the principle of sufficient reason, and there is no reason for thinking the principle of sufficient reason is true, there is no reason for thinking that the premises of the cosmological argument are true. I mean, they might be true, but they have not been shown to be true. Therefore, there is no reason for thinking that the cosmological argument is sound. You shouldn't be surprised. Right? The question of God's existence is a philosophical question, a question that has yet to be answered. Maybe you feel like you've answered it, but it has not been demonstrated to be true or false. True that God exists. Now, the burden of proof does not fall to the atheist. It falls to the theist. We have no obligation to prove negative facts. Only positive ones. At least that's what the principle of sufficient reason says. It will be helpful, especially for the exam, for you to distinguish the key characteristics of each of these arguments and kind of sort the elements in your mind into these categories. So the ontological argument, remember, used the valid means of arguing called reductio ad absurdum, where you assume a proposition P is true, derive an absurdity, which in the case of the ontological argument was a contradiction, and then you deny your initial assumption. It appealed to a very particular conception of God, that of the being than which none greater is conceivable, or the BGC. It's an a priori argument, that is, appeals to reason, not sense experience, and the idea is if you grasp the concept of God as the greatest conceivable being, you know that God exists, because if he didn't, that would entail that a contradiction or an absurdity is true, and they can't be true. It appeals to the idea that existence is a great-making quality, that to exist in reality makes a thing a greater thing. That is something that Kant questioned, and the argument is ultimately unsound. The cosmological argument, on the other hand, uses also a valid means of arguing. It's called disjunctive syllogism, where in the first premise we have a disjunction and or statement, in the second premise we have the denial of one of the disjuncts, and in the last premise we have the remaining disjunct. That the conception of God at play in the cosmological argument is that of a self-caused being. God is not a brute fact, but God is self-existent or contains within himself sufficient reason for his own existence. Cosmological arguments are a posteriori, That is, there's always some appeal to something we know on the basis of sense experience. And it's not that God exists. We don't see or smell or touch or taste God, but we see or smell or touch or taste coffee cups, contingent, dependent things. And then we go looking for an explanation for their existence, that there can't be an infinite series of causes, and so there has to be a first cause if you're Aquinas, or in the more modern version of the cosmological argument, that if there were an infinite series of dependent things, that would violate the second part of the principle of sufficient reason. There'd be a positive fact that had no explanation. So the cosmological argument, even Aquinas implicitly, is appealing to the principle of sufficient reason that says everything that exists has an explanation for its existence, and every positive fact also has some story that can be told in virtue of which it is a fact. And again, the argument is unsound. Keep those clear in your head. Now, I'm not assigning the design argument this semester, but perhaps I'll put the PowerPoint up for it. You could read that in the book. There's also Pascal's wager, which is more like, well, you know, if I'm a gambling man, and he is, that I'd rather believe that God exists and have it turn out that I'm wrong than not believe that he exists and turn out wrong, which could really screw up my day. Anyways, thanks for playing, and I'll see you next time at the problem of evil.